Em 21 de março de 2026, o canal do YouTube Hype Mike publicou um vídeo sobre uma investigação de 24 horas no interior das Montanhas Apalaches, uma das regiões selvagens mais antigas e temidas da América do Norte. A equipe viajou até uma cabana isolada ligada a um desaparecimento misterioso, mas muito antes de chegarem ao local, as montanhas já pareciam estranhas.
They say the mountain has rules. If you see something, no you didn't. If you hear something, no you didn't. Do not leave your windows open after dark. Don't ever go into the woods at night, and never, ever whistle. Tonight, we're gonna be putting those rules to the test.
No início da jornada, avisos de moradores e histórias antigas já deixavam o clima tenso. Pessoas teriam desaparecido ali sem deixar qualquer vestígio, enquanto outras afirmavam ouvir vozes chamando seus nomes no meio da floresta.
Disappearance inside the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Search teams are still looking for any trace of the missing hiker.
Rangers are investigating reports of strange activity deep in the Appalachian backcountry, including hikers claiming they heard their names being called from the woods when no one was there.
The Appalachian Mountains is often considered one of the most haunted and paranormally active regions in all of North America. A vast, ancient wilderness that spans nearly 2,000 miles across the continent. And the stories that tie to this place go back nearly 500 million years. Long before search and rescue, native tribes warned us about something in this forest that was capable of making people vanish without a trace.
Even now, some rangers say there are parts of the mountain that they don't like entering alone. And when people go missing here, they don't always leave evidence. Sometimes the dogs stop tracking for no reason. Sometimes footsteps just end. And sometimes they're found.
You know, the Appalachian Mountains, the range. Like, this
It's
is
like the biggest range of paranormal land in the entire world.
That's what I'm saying.
Wow. And I feel like it's
Weird. Which?
You heard that? That was weird.
Bro, it's like dead quiet.
I'm so scared right now.
It's so quiet.
Wait, that's one of the things they say.
What?
If the forest goes quiet, that means you've already entered the thin spot.
No way. Really?
Already? Like,
Pouco tempo depois, o grupo ouviu um som estranho vindo de algum lugar entre as árvores. Ninguém conseguiu identificar exatamente o que o produziu, mas certamente não parecia o som de nenhum animal comum que eles conheciam.
don't be saying
I
that.
literally
Like,
just said that we feel like we teleported.
Bro.
you think I want to?
Things can get summoned?
I already have like chills down my spine, and we literally just started.
Yeah.
I have a weird feeling about this.
This is
that weird
bad.
sound back there.
It sounded like a goat man. Like a
It's-
weird...
There was like I don't know, it sounded like almost like a creature. I don't know.
Oh, dude.
It could have
I
been a
do kind of
wolf
see the goat man
or like
part.
coyote
And
maybe.
it wasn't like a wolf, but it was kind of like a goat wolf. It was really weird.
Yeah.
Hopefully the mic picked that up.
Yeah.
I hope so.
It says here that the distance between our realm and the spiritual one is significantly more thin, allowing for strange things to pass through.
Dude.
Or someone walking into it find themselves somewhere completely different than they were 5 minutes ago.
Dude, that's
Yo.
exactly what just happened.
It literally feels like that, right? It actually feels like that. I was gonna say, I'm like, something's not right, but this might.
Alguns minutos depois, o radiocomunicador deles começou a agir de forma estranha. Ele mudou sozinho para o canal de emergência, sobre o qual haviam sido alertados pouco antes, e ruídos incomuns passaram a sair pelo alto-falante, deixando todos confusos e inquietos.
18.
What?
It just said 18?
Is that the only like channel?
I always have it on 21. Like,
way.
it's always I turn it on, it's 21.
And now it's 18.
Bro.
Okay.
That's weird.
Wait, so it says that it's gonna go on 18. Isn't that what it literally told us though?
No, it said we have to go on 18, and it started at 18.
Okay, what?
I wonder if I could hear something.
It's like the only option.
Roger that. Anybody there? I said that backwards.
Uh,
Alright, I didn't say that right at all.
now what is it?
Oh, wait, what?
Yo!
Shh. What the hell is that?
What is that?
Something wrong with this thing? Hello? What was that?
Bro.
is going on?
Dude, something is not right.
It's like glitching out. It's like almost like it's not even on.
I mean, I noticed like
Enquanto continuavam caminhando pela neve, fizeram uma descoberta perturbadora. No meio da trilha, havia apenas uma única bota abandonada.
they literally got the snow gone in the boot, and yeah, just like that.
Makes sense.
You mean like that?
Whoa!
What?
Is that a boot?
No, it looks like a rock.
Bro, there's like a
Logo.
there's a logo.
Wait, what? Oh, Jesus. Okay, well. Oh.
No way.
Wait, look at it.
Holy shit. It's actually a boot.
It's a boot?
What?
Dude.
Yeah. There's no logo on it though.
Here, bring it here.
Here.
Wait, what the hell?
No way.
Dude, look at this. I'm fully in here. Grab this.
Okay.
Bro's entrenched.
This is crazy.
You're not getting out of there.
Come on.
Okay. At least the trail's good. Whew. Could be worse.
Man.
What a freaking.
Mais cedo, eles haviam descoberto que uma mulher desaparecida ligada à cabana foi encontrada apenas por meio de uma mochila e uma bota. A coincidência foi suficiente para deixar todos bastante desconfortáveis.
Freaking boot though?
Yeah, it's kind of weird.
You think that's her boot though? Because it's one boot.
Wait. Yeah, you're right.
There's no other
Isn't
one?
that what it said? You're right about that.
Yeah.
It was one boot.
Here, get me out of here.
Like, that's true. It was one boot, right?
Yeah, that's what it
On the poster, it said they found her backpack and they found a boot.
Yeah.
So she was missing one boot.
But
Right.
it said winter boot. That's a rain boot.
Oh.
So
Yeah,
you
no.
don't think it's hers? It looks like a girl's boot though.
It's hard to say. It is a rain boot, though. What they would have said rain boot otherwise.
Yeah.
Wait,
that's
where's
true.
the logo?
That's what I'm saying. There was
Yeah,
no logo
what
on
the
it.
Did we just imagine a logo?
I saw a
Yeah,
logo.
That's why I said I didn't see a logo at all. It looked like a rock to
That's
me.
crazy.
I literally saw. What the hell?
I saw like
Does
a
this
logo.
area make you guys delusional?
No. I actually
didn't.
saw a logo. What the?
That's crazy. It was a logo there, but that wasn't there.
No, that
Yeah,
wasn't.
that's
It
what you
wasn't
saw, the
green.
one that's embedded inside the boot.
Yeah.
Dude, it was literally like sitting like this.
And it was like here, right?
Quanto mais avançavam pela trilha, mais estranhas as coisas ficavam. Um grito ecoou pelas montanhas, soando quase como o de uma pessoa.
Bigfoot.
Bigfoot?
What? Dude, there's no Bigfoot, bro.
No, that's
There's
the
no
most
such thing as.
ridiculous
Whoa, whoa.
What was that? What was that?
Dude, is that Pharaoh guy?
Dude, that was literally like a person screaming.
Hello?
What
do you mean?
They're gonna come after us.
Pharaoh people, bro?
Did it sound like it was gonna kill us?
This
No.
place is closed. We're
Wait,
not even allowed to be here.
Mais tarde, alguns membros do grupo começaram a sentir que já haviam passado pelas mesmas árvores antes, mesmo sem terem voltado pelo caminho. Era como se a própria floresta estivesse fazendo com que andassem em círculos.
Yo, guys.
Yeah.
This tree.
Yeah.
I'm like almost 90% sure we walked past it already.
I think so.
Did we go back somehow?
No, there's no way, right?
Like this tree, I swear we walked. I don't know.
I don't think so, bro. We've only been going.
And no, that one too. I feel like I saw that one already.
Really? You could be right.
But it doesn't
How
make
would
any
that even
sense.
make sense?
We didn't turn around at all.
You think it's going in like a loop?
Maybe like when we found that the boot, we
Ooh,
like.
went the other way.
No, we did not go the other way though. We continued on
Yeah.
I feel like
because we walked
if
past.
we did walk by it, I could like show it on the screen, but it's a lot of footage to go back on.
Yeah, I don't know. Doesn't make sense. And I mean, like, I noticed the mountain is still there, but like, obviously it's a mountain, so like, who knows? If we've been going straight, it makes sense.
Yeah.
That's weird.
Okay, well,
Be careful.
I mean, now that you mention it, I remember there being a fork in the road.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
That's
you
so
are right.
true.
This is so weird. Yeah. There's no way we went back by accident. I'm so confused.
I feel like the moment we enter this area, it was like we were for sure in a thin spot because
Like, immediately we could tell.
like
something was
the
not right.
sound of the forest is gone. Like,
Foi então que algo apareceu no meio da trilha que nenhum deles se lembrava de ter visto antes. Ao lado, havia pegadas que sugeriam que outra pessoa poderia estar por perto, observando cada movimento do grupo.
is it? What the hell is that thing?
Yeah, dude.
I don't know. But we didn't.
Did we go through a circle?
If this is a circle, then what is that?
Dude, where did that come from, man? That is creepy.
is that?
Bro, it looks like a cursed item.
Someone's fucking with us. I'm telling you.
One of the
something ain't
feral
right.
people?
Dude, I swear there's like cursed items that.
Whoa. I saw something moving over there.
Really?
What?
Kind of stressing me out here.
Wait.
What? Something there?
Like a figure walking by the trees.
Really?
No way.
Like in that gap right there.
Yeah. So creepy. Dude, just keep going, I think. Because I don't like this. I feel like something's watching us, literally.
Yeah, like up in the
Like up in the, like anywhere, honestly. It's so creepy. Yeah. But to be fair, we could be just like, you know, thinking it's creepy and all the placebos kind of getting to us.
How do we think it's creepy when this is creepy?
Exactly. Somebody put this here. It doesn't just.
Maybe we didn't do circle and we're just going absolutely bananas. That's all.
Whatever that is, it's not good news.
Well, you just started noticing we were seeing the same things.
Yeah.
But this is obviously
Not
something we
that
wouldn't
we-
have missed.
no.
It's in the middle of the trail.
Yeah, they want.
But wait. Look,
Footprints.
the footprints. There's footprints behind it.
Oh.
So it's either we did pass it and someone placed it in the time that we were gone,
Maybe.
or someone else is here with us.
I feel like if I cross this, something bad's gonna happen.
Yeah, it's almost like a do not. It's like an exit, like do not enter sign.
You think we should put it on the ground?
Like, bro, the twine. Oh, it's kind of creepy.
Dude, I don't know if I want to touch that thing.
Logo depois, mais sons estranhos começaram a vir da floresta, fazendo com que eles se convencessem de que não estavam sozinhos.
You heard that?
Back there.
Yeah.
Up there.
Something is looking at us. I swear to
Big God.
Yeah, it's bad.
Okay, so do not want to go that way.
So do you want to just go?
I think we do the.
Finalmente, depois de horas de caminhada, eles chegaram à propriedade. A cabana parecia abandonada, as portas estavam abertas e todo o lugar parecia estranho desde o momento em que chegaram.
Wait a minute. Okay, good. We're making progress, boys. I'm liking that. Oh,
Finally.
freedom!
No snow.
No more snow.
Oh God. Okay.
Except it's mud.
Yeah, now it's mud. Love that. But what is this?
What?
Is this the cabin?
That does not look like a cabin.
Looks like a shed.
Yeah, right? What is that?
This place is a lot bigger than they told me on the phone.
Right?
Even a pitchfork over there.
Something ain't right.
Yeah.
No, dude.
Dude,
What?
fucking firewood everywhere.
That's
Wait,
not a pitchfork.
wait. No.
Dude.
Another one?
What the f
There's
is that
no-
doing there?
Okay, well, that's it's like not necessarily a bad thing, right?
It's a bad thing.
It means we're heading in the right direction.
It's
It's almost like a checkpoint. But I mean, we
Yeah,
still don't know what it
checkpoint.
is. It could just be like, you know, the feral people, right?
What?
It could just be.
Do you think they took over the cabin?
No, I'm saying this could be their road signs, like how we have
That's
street
bad.
signs
That
everywhere.
means that they're there.
I don't want to run into a feral person right now.
Well, okay, it could be anything, but I'm just saying, like, it's progress, right?
The cabin door is open. Kind of creepy, man.
It could also be the people that set up the cabins. This is their way of, you know, letting you know that these are checkpoints.
I don't know. He said no one's been here in a long time.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, clearly, because there is an unbelievable amount of wood here that has not been used.
Yeah.
Okay, well, look around.
Yeah. Wait,
Yeah, the cabin
Yeah,
door.
he said the door was open.
I told you.
is this the cabin?
That's never good.
Dude, it's so eerie. Like, what the heck?
Mas a descoberta mais perturbadora veio momentos depois. Perto da cabana havia o que parecia ser uma fita de cena de crime ainda ativa, sugerindo que a investigação do desaparecimento ainda estava em andamento.
I don't see any cars though. Like maybe he's not even here.
Yeah, this place looks like it hasn't been visited in a while.
Yeah.
Jeez, so creepy.
Right?
Wait a minute.
No way.
Oh shit.
I see that.
Oh no. Crime scene.
Yeah.
Guys, we can't even go in there.
Dude, there's even the little key, kind of like the cue cards.
Oh yeah.
This is one.
Wait, what the heck?
Maybe we should not be here.
Well, maybe because they're still investigating the girl's disappearance.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
This is bad.
Mesmo com a fita de cena de crime no local, eles decidiram entrar, já que tinham autorização do próprio dono da propriedade para realizar a investigação. Ainda assim, o clima ficou ainda mais pesado, e pouco tempo depois a noite caiu rapidamente sobre a região, deixando tudo ainda mais escuro e inquietante.
Oh no.
Is that candles? What is it? What is going on?
That's crazy. What do we do about that?
Why is there candles outside?
Do we investigate?
Well, yeah.
Hello?
Just make sure not.
Yeah.
Guys, this is so weird.
Eles começam a ouvir passos e uma voz em algum lugar dentro da casa. Então o telefone toca. Achando que poderia ser o dono, eles atendem, mas tudo o que escutam são sons e vozes perturbadoras. Nesse momento, começam a temer que alguém ou algo tenha os atraído até a cabana. E agora saiba que eles estão ali. Acreditando que os sons vêm do andar de cima, eles sobem para investigar.
Oh, what the was that?
Whoa.
What was that? Hello?
Footsteps.
Hello?
Dude, it's actually over here.
Yeah, it's coming. That way. It's so
Hello?
Bro, this is so strange.
I just heard something.
Really?
Like a voice.
Get out of here, bro.
Like that over there.
Phone.
Wait, that's right there.
What?
It's right there.
Maybe it's the owner.
Oh,
yeah.
that makes sense. Okay, dude, we're losing our minds here.
It's stuck.
What the heck?
Hello? What is that?
Whoa.
What's that?
What is that? Guys, this isn't. I don't like this. I don't like
Leave
this at all.
now?
Yeah, that's bad.
I don't like this.
That was weird.
How does it know that we're here?
You think that's the owner?
Eles veem olhos brilhantes observando na escuridão. Eles leem as regras locais para permanecer na área e continuam ouvindo movimentos por perto. Então, decidem fechar as janelas. Quando precisam de lenha, 2 deles saem para fora.
What?
2 glowing eyes.
Whoa!
Look!
Bro.
See it?
Yeah. Oh my god, dude, that's so creepy.
What the hell?
Holy.
It's gone now. It's gone. It's one. It's just my camera.
Wait, what? How does that work?
Like,
How does that work?
It's eyes. It's eyes, bro. It has to be.
Dude, there's nothing there.
Bro, we're on the 2nd floor.
What could be watching us?
Maybe
man?
the,
Is there a roof there?
The courtyard. No, there's a courtyard. Out in the distance.
Dude,
I'm
that's
pretty sure
weird.
we saw when we were walking up.
That's fucking
You
weird.
think something's literally watching us?
I mean, it's possible. That's what she was saying, right? Literally 3 days in a row, something's watching her. All the blindies, we need to shut them off. We need to lock the doors. We need to make sure nothing can get in here and nothing can see us in here.
Yeah. What? Did you hear that too?
Okay, let's grab the firewood. Get the fuck out of here.
We gotta hurry. You don't know what's out there. Here we go.
Grab this. How much do you think we need?
I don't know, like 4 maybe?
Okay, 4.
Shh. Whoa. From over there, man. We need to hurry. Dude, you have to hurry.
This one looks good.
Bro, come on.
You hear the whistling?
Yeah, what the heck? Dude.
Get the fuck out of here. Go, go. What the hell?
Bro, it's right there.
Oh my god! Whoa! Go!
Enquanto recolhem a lenha, eles ouvem assobios e passos atrás deles e correm de volta para a cabana, convencidos de que algo estava seguindo eles.
Someone whistling, and then we heard something like running after us.
Wait, like from the roofs.
Yeah.
The whistling.
Yes.
Did you shut the door?
Oh, dude.
Locked it. I don't like that at all. Here. So something's out there like watching us.
Can you lock it? Is it locked?
I think so.
Like, so what is it?
I don't know. I was grabbing this, and then whistling from where we originally entered,
Yeah.
like where that stick was. And then once we heard the whistling, we're like, okay, we got to get the hell out of here. And then as we're like running, it like almost like footsteps behind us.
Dude,
Like
that's
I'm out
so
of breath,
creepy.
thinking, oh my god.
Vários dispositivos reagem enquanto eles realizam uma sessão espírita. A Spirit Box começa a dar respostas estranhas, incluindo avisos de que não é seguro estar ali. As respostas parecem inteligentes, como se algo estivesse ouvindo a conversa deles. Eles ficam cada vez mais convencidos de que há alguma presença no local. O telefone volta a tocar, e atender só torna a situação ainda mais perigosa.
Rules.
Who's calling?
What the hell?
Hello? Someone called earlier on the phone.
Yo, listen.
Oh, dude.
What?
It's calling.
Wait, what the
That's crazy, bro.
Still. Dude, there's no way I'm answering that.
No, don't answer. Don't answer.
No. Answer it.
Answer it. Are you
Tell us to
crazy?
do it.
You think it's the owner?
It could be.
Hello? What the fuck is that? Listen.
What the fuck?
At the door.
At the door.
Which door?
Did you hear that?
What the fuck was...
Bro, is it trying to break
what
in?
the fuck was that? Dude, why did it just say that? We didn't even say anything.
Is it trying to break in?
Dude, something just banged on the door.
Forte estrondo atinge a porta da frente no mesmo momento em que a Spirit Box diz que há algo ali. A temperatura cai de repente e o aparelho avisa para não abrirem a porta. Eles ignoram o aviso e abrem mesmo assim. Logo em seguida, a Spirit Box afirma que agora está dentro.
What the hell was that on the phone?
I don't know, man. That was weird.
Don't open it.
Open what? The door?
It wants in.
It wants in.
What the hell? Bro, fuck, I don't like this.
Yeah.
Dude, do we go to the door now?
No, come on. It wants in, dude.
What happens if we open the door?
What happens if we let it in?
We actually heard it bang.
We actually
And there's
heard it bang.
nobody there. We're gonna open the door.
Yeah.
Alright. Should we open it?
Yeah, open it.
We're gonna open the door.
Alright, Jesse, you got this.
Yeah, go Jesse.
Thanks, guys.
You see anything?
Bro, don't do it.
It's inside
Dude,
now!
close the door, bro. It's already in.
It's inside now!
What does that mean? How is it
You
inside?
opened the door and now it's inside!
Bro.
That is scary, bro. You didn't see anything?
No.
It's in now.
Cold wind entered.
Oh, yeah.
Too late.
Too late.
man.
Why is it just saying things back to back?
Wait, there's something there.
Really?
Is that a boot?
It's a f***ing boot.
No, it's a boot.
Bro, I literally thought it was yours. I opened the door, I saw
No
it,
way,
but I
it's a
thought
boot.
now it makes sense because yours are right here.
Yeah, no, I tripped
Holy
on.
Eles decidem quebrar mais regras e abrir as janelas. Vozes parecem vir de todas as direções, e eles voltam a ver os olhos brilhantes na escuridão.
Whoa. Dude, guys, there's something right there.
Get out of here. You said there's something
No,
there.
I swear, it's right. It's looking at me.
What do you mean it's looking at you?
Bro.
Go look. See out of the window.
Hello? I see you.
It's like two pair of eyes.
Get the hell out of here.
Yeah.
Wait, what is it? What is it doing? Is
I
it
see
ringing?
you.
You're recording it?
Yeah. Bro, it's kind of I think it's walking this
I
way,
think-
guys. I'm gonna close the door.
He said it though, he said it.
Okay, so what? Does that count? Like,
Guys.
Did you say it?
Yeah, I see you. I'm looking at you.
Okay, so that
What the
counts.
hell?
Yeah, it counts.
That counts as breaking
It
the
started walking the second I said that.
Whoa!
What the hell?
The door!
Bro, someone's breaking in.
You're not alone here.
Oh, dude.
What the f?
This is bad,
Gotta
bro.
go look. Yeah, front door. That was it.
You saw the two pair of eyes, right?
Was that close enough to like have that thing? You should have seen it.
Yeah.
The way that it moved, it like something I've never even seen before. It's not human.
Should we check?
Yeah.
Oh, there's something outside.
Listen. What is that sound?
So good. It sounds like right outside the door.
Yo.
What is that?
Like a toy? Why is that blocking the door?
Bro, it's moving.
It's the boot.
Yo.
The boot.
Bro, from outside. Dude,
How is that happening right now?
why the? Wait. Not even just a boot, guys. Look. Look at all this stuff.
We're locked in.
How did it do that so quickly?
I don't know.
We didn't even hear like that.
We didn't hear. We heard everything.
Marking its territory.
Yo.
Oh my god! Wait, what?
That's crazy.
It's marking.
Guys,
Dude, that just gave me shivers.
Yeah.
if this thing is still here,
Oh my god.
fucked.
We're so dumb. It literally brought all this stuff here.
Dude, how did it even lift all this stuff?
I don't know.
What was that?
What's that?
I don't know.
Tracking.
Someone was tracking, right?
Yeah, downstairs.
Quando tentam verificar a porta, eles encontram objetos bloqueando a passagem, e a Spirit Box diz que aquilo está marcando seu território. Por fim, eles decidem ir embora. No caminho para fora, encontram sangue, ouvem vozes e gritos estranhos e veem uma pessoa carregando fogo.
Is that a sleeping bag? Guys, I think he's about to light the sleeping bag on fire. He's staring at us. Run! Run!
Run! Go! 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 Go!
He's coming! Go! He's coming! Let's go! Run!
Holy cow, dude, let's get out of here.
A princípio, eles pensam que se trata de um acampamento, mas a pessoa está colocando fogo em um saco de dormir. Um dos celulares toca e a figura percebe a presença deles. Eles correm de volta em direção à cabana, apenas para ver mais figuras segurando tocha de fogo.
Guys,
What? What?
This guy there.
three of them? Wait, are you seeing this, guys?
Yeah. We gotta go. Inside.
How's there three? I don't know.
Roll. Go.
Here, grab a table, a chair.
Yeah, chair. Let's go.
Insane. Why is there three?
Out the way. Here. Good. Yo,
Bro.
dude. Go. Run. Upstairs. Go.
Guys, come on, let's get out of here.
The truck.
Over here.
Man, there's no room here. Guys, there's no room for all of us. There's no room for all of us.
Eles se trancam em um quarto. Depois de algum tempo, as figuras desaparecem. Assim que percebem que o silêncio volta a tomar conta da casa, eles aproveitam a chance e saem dali o mais rápido possível, sem pensar duas vezes em passar a noite naquele lugar. Eles abandonam a cabana imediatamente, ainda em choque com tudo o que aconteceu, sem conseguir entender o que eram aquelas pessoas ou coisas com tochas de fogo nas mãos e sem nenhuma explicação para os eventos estranhos daquela noite. O youtuber Luke, do canal Outdoor Gear Review, entrou em uma floresta isolada e coberta por vegetação para realizar uma busca cuidadosa e detalhada por possíveis evidências do pé grande. A região exata dos Apalaches onde ele estava não foi revelada, mas os vales íngremes, a mata densa e as antigas montanhas da área davam ao local uma aparência extremamente remota. Embora ainda se considerasse cético, depois de ouvir uma série de sons estranhos durante um acampamento recente, ele começou a questionar o que poderia estar se movendo em algum lugar naquela vasta área selvagem.
What's taken place and why I'm doing this episode, why it's been requested. So, over the last year or so, I've been coming up here to what I call the Green Forest. I've had numerous odd experiences. The first odd experience began someplace on top of this mountain, and I came across what looked like a trail. All of the trees have been broken and basically like stacked, like leaned in a certain way. It was rather odd. A few months later, I was hiking to this location, something big. As soon as whatever it was heard me, it burst through the forest. You can hear it breaking limbs and snapping trees as it ran. Then, last week, I came out here for a camping trip. It was beginning to storm. Basically, I was turning in for the night, and I heard a grunt, and it sounded like this. Woo! One time only. What was that sound? I have no...
Luke documentou árvores que haviam sido quebradas e posicionadas de maneiras que não pareciam compatíveis com danos causados por tempestades comuns. Mesmo mantendo uma abordagem lógica, ele admitiu que o vale transmitia uma sensação estranha e pesada naquele dia. Enquanto explorava a área, encontrou partes de musgo arrancadas do tronco de uma árvore. Debaixo delas, havia marcas profundas que pareciam ter sido feitas com muita força e de propósito. Então, o estalo alto de um grande galho chamou sua atenção de repente, ecoando pela floresta silenciosa de pinheiros antigos.
Another spot where the moss has been torn off this tree. And check that out. Claws have gone through that. Sure do love this landscape. It is gorgeous out here. Speaking of which, I cannot say where this is at. It's a secret. That may anger you, that's fine. But the last thing that I want is 500,000+ subscribers out here stomping around, you know what I mean? Of course, and I'm sure you understand it.
Sua busca o levou a passar por fezes de urso e seguir por uma rede de trilhas profundas usadas por animais. A vegetação era tão densa que ele mal conseguia enxergar alguns metros à frente, criando inúmeros lugares onde um animal de grande porte poderia permanecer completamente escondido.
That's a few days old. Okay, so check this out. There's a game trail through here. Oh yeah. But it goes from over there to over here. Let's follow it for just a bit. See if we can spot any tracks or anything. Check this out. The bear's been coming this direction and going over this fallen tree. All of the moss has been knocked off.
Mais tarde, Luke instalou câmeras de trilha perto de um tronco que parecia ter sido movido com uma força impressionante. Conforme o tempo passava, ele admitiu que o isolamento do local criava a inquietante sensação de que algo poderia estar observando seus movimentos de algum ponto escondido naquela interminável muralha de árvores.
Okay, it's set. The thing about this forest, everyone, with it being so dense, so thick, it can feel like somebody's out here watching you or something. Visibility is about 20 feet. That's about it.
Quando analisou as gravações depois, ele encontrou uma figura que ele acredita ser um urso. Luke também explicou como o medo pode afetar a percepção das pessoas e fazê-las imaginar ameaças que talvez nem existam. Mas, mesmo com seu foco na lógica, nas evidências e no ceticismo, ele ainda teve dificuldade para explicar a descoberta final que encontrou.
Thousands of people that I've spoken to after putting up these episodes, not a single person can provide any evidence. Not a single piece of evidence. I may tell you that I disagree with your assessment, but hey, that's how it goes. That's life. People disagree. And that leads me to believe that Bigfoot does not exist. And I'll explain what I mean by that. I have spoken to people literally all around the world, and these viewers feel like they've had a Bigfoot experience. Because if there's that many people having experiences with Bigfoot, then why can't Bigfoot be found? If that many people have had experiences and no evidence has been captured. This was not here yesterday. I'm so confused, everybody. This is a large tree.
No fim, Luke não encontrou nenhuma prova concreta de que algo anormal estivesse realmente na floresta, apenas sinais isolados que poderiam ser explicados por causas naturais. Mesmo assim, a sensação estranha do lugar permaneceu, mas sem evidências suficientes para sustentar qualquer conclusão. Sem mais nada para investigar, ele decidiu encerrar a expedição e saiu dali. Em 26 de maio de 2026, o youtuber Jasco e seu amigo Chandler chegaram à famosa Cabana 13, escondida no fundo das montanhas Apalaches. A cabana também é conhecida como Cabana do Assassinato. Foi o local onde Cheryl Filippo foi brutalmente morta por seu marido em 1996. Desde o momento em que entram, o ambiente já carrega uma sensação pesada. Jasco explica o cenário de crime encenado e a ganância que parece ter deixado uma energia sombria e vingativa presa dentro das paredes.
In late April 1996, James Filippo and his wife Cheryl drove from their home in Nitro, West Virginia to Cabin 13 for what was supposed to be a romantic retreat. But in the early morning hours of April 30th, their quiet vacation turned into a violent nightmare. At 2:11 a.m., Filippo placed a frantic call to 911 from a nearby payphone. He claimed that a masked intruder had broken into the cabin, attacked the couple with a knife and a piece of wood, knocked him unconscious, and severely injured Cheryl. Responding deputies found Flippo outside the cabin wearing only his underwear with minor wounds on his legs. He said that a vehicle had been stolen and that he had run for help. Inside cabin 13, however, officers discovered a far more disturbing scene. Cheryl was bludgeoned to death. Her body was left in a pool of blood. Investigators quickly noticed inconsistencies in Flippo's stories. There were no signs of forced entry or disturbance in the muddy ground outside the cabin.
A atividade começou quase imediatamente. Pela Spirit Box, uma mensagem surgiu falando sobre um espírito em busca de vingança. Ao mesmo tempo, Jasco percebeu o que parecia ser uma figura sombria perto das árvores, parada observando eles à distância.
He's serving life in prison. Is he still alive?
Drowning happened.
James,
We're right by a body of water.
Literally.
There's a river. Swear to God, I thought I just saw someone standing there for a second, then it was gone. Was that a human, or was that...
Yeah. Who's down there?
Well, as long as they stay down there, I'm fine.
You're asking if James is still alive. I don't know, but I know that the murder happened in 1996, so...
Okay.
Could be.
Before he was even born, that's crazy. But anyways, the fact that it said revenge seeker, I wonder if it's like Cheryl is vengeful, obviously, of what her husband did.
True.
And she wants to get like...
Yeah.
Mais tarde, às 2 da manhã, Jasco caminha sozinho em direção à estrada de terra. A área está completamente em silêncio. Então, vindo da escuridão total da floresta, ele ouve uma voz chamando seu nome. O mais perturbador é que a voz soa exatamente como a de Chandler.
Okay, so Chandler needed his headphones and I needed, Chandler? Wait a second. I was gonna say, I'm gonna call him real quick. I don't have service. Bro. Chandler. No. Why did they want me to go to the road? I have chills right now. No. Okay. What's wrong with you?
What do you mean?
I heard you.
Where?
Down the fucking drill. Don't do that shit.
What are you talking about?
You called my name.
No. What do you mean? I just got set up with all my stuff.
I literally went to the car to grab your headphones.
Yeah.
Grab myself a pair of sweatpants. Bro, I'm standing at the trunk. Trunk's open. And I just hear, Jazz? And I turn around and I'm like, Chandler? So I go to the steps. Nothing there. Nothing on the path.
I was killed.
Oh my God.
A noite não se acalma. Nas primeiras horas da madrugada, um estrondo enorme os desperta de repente. Algo está batendo com força nas paredes da cabana. Nesse momento, eles percebem que não estavam sozinhos ali.
Jazz. Jazz? Yo, Yasko! Yeah. Hey,
What?
get up.
Okay, I'm up.
Get up. I don't know.
What happened?
Come on. There's somebody outside. I don't know who or what. It's just banging.
Com todos os acontecimentos cada vez mais intensos e assustadores durante a noite, Jasco e Chandler decidem não continuar no local, sem conseguir encontrar explicações para o que estavam vivendo e com a sensação de que algo estava se aproximando cada vez mais da cabana. Eles abandonam a cabana 13 antes do amanhecer e vão embora rapidamente, sem conseguir passar a noite ali. Dark Exploration Films compartilhou um vídeo em 9 de novembro de 2024. O vídeo começa com o explorador partindo para um desafio que ele nunca tinha tentado antes. Ele planeja caminhar profundamente pelas montanhas Apalaches durante a noite e passar a madrugada dentro de uma torre de observação de incêndios abandonada que não é usada desde a década de 1970.
All right, everybody. Let me go over what we're doing today. Today, we're going to be right off the Appalachian Trail. We're going to be climbing a mountain at night and going to be camping at the abandoned fire tower. Fire towers were a big thing last 100 years before telecommunications was so popular. People would sit on these fire towers, look off into the distance for smoke, and if there was smoke, they would tell the neighboring fire department where the coordinates kind of are, and they would go investigate. This specific fire tower has been vacant since 1970, so it's been about 50-something years since it's been maintained and such. It's a location I've always wanted to do. I love hiking, I love abandon, I love mixing those two worlds together, and my newfound love is camping.
Quando ele finalmente chega à torre, ela está de pé, mas de forma inquietante. Por um momento, ele acha que vê algum movimento lá dentro, mas quando olha novamente, não há nada.
Oh, that wind is crazy right now. Holy. We're almost at the top. It's so windy up here. It's crazy. Here we are. Hello? Oh, jeez. Whew. It's just wood. It's not too bad in here. It's covered. Let me look beneath me though. I need to make sure it's reinforced. Because look, there's a hole right there.
Lá dentro, ele monta seu equipamento enquanto a estrutura faz estalos estranhos. O vento fica irregular, quase como se algo estivesse atingindo a torre, em vez de simplesmente passar por ela.
We made it. I hope the wind isn't too bad. I looked at the bottom of this thing. As long as I sleep this way, there's a couple support beams going this way, so it should support me. I hope the wind isn't too bad. But we're finally up here after about 2 hours of walking and hiking. Holy crap. Wow, this thing shakes a lot. Wow. That's pretty crazy. This is gonna be quite the night. Anyway, I'm just gonna try to get my bearings.
O vento forte continuava atingindo a antiga torre, fazendo ela balançar e ranger. A cada movimento, ele se sentia mais desconfortável, se perguntando se tinha sido uma boa ideia passar a noite ali. Depois de terminar o jantar, ele se acomoda para dormir e, eventualmente, acaba pegando no sono dentro da torre. A noite passa em silêncio, e ele acorda na manhã seguinte com a primeira luz surgindo sobre as montanhas. Com a sensação estranha da noite aos poucos desaparecendo, ele arruma seu equipamento e deixa a torre. O canal do YouTube Dawson Toller publicou este vídeo em que os exploradores chegam às Montanhas Apalaches, na cabana Henry Whitehead, em Cades Cove, durante a noite, para investigar uma das cabanas mais antigas ainda preservadas da região.
Guys, right now we are in front of the Henry Whitehead cabin. So this cabin is one of the original cabins to ever be here. And it is one of the last one, or sorry, let me correct myself. It is one of the only original ones still standing. We are going to be investigating it because shout out my researcher, Reality Remixer, because he found some awesome information about this place that you can't find just like online looking this cabin up.
Enquanto começam a explorar do lado de fora da cabana em completa escuridão, um dos exploradores de repente avista uma figura parecida com uma pessoa se movendo atrás da estrutura. Confusos e inquietos, eles fazem uma busca cuidadosa por toda a área, mas não encontram nada.
Because some of the stuff that I'm about to tell you is absolutely, positively...
Hey, wait.
What?
I think somebody's already over here. I saw somebody just walking behind the house. So I don't know if someone
are you talking about?
Right there on it. I think it's a person, but I saw something just like, I was looking at the house, I just saw somebody walking like...
Dude, there's no cars, there's nobody that lives out here.
Okay.
Hold up.
Yeah, look at the cameras.
No, grab that camera. We're gonna sit in the car real quick because there's no people that should be out here.
Okay.
Hold up.
I was gonna say it could be a homeless person, but we're in the middle of the mountains. Hello?
don't. Hold on.
A situação os deixa abalados, pois não há carros nem sinais de outras pessoas na área. Em seguida, eles entram na cabana para iniciar a investigação, mas coisas estranhas continuam acontecendo. Um morcego voa pelo interior escuro, obrigando-os a sair.
Be careful in case it is a homeless person. Yeah. Hey, if there's anybody out here, we're just here to film a YouTube video. And this is a warning right now. If you are here, come out. Because we don't want to be responsible for what happens next.
We're not here to cause anyone harm. We're just here to shoot a video. But if someone does not announce themselves right now and tries to jump out at us in the next few minutes, I am loaded. And this is your last warning. So if there is someone here, let us know right now so we don't get spooked.
Don't go too close to the tree line.
You're shine over here for a second.
Do you want the flashlight?
Yeah. Is there anyone back here?
Quando eles retornam, montam equipamentos paranormais e começam a fazer perguntas, tentando se comunicar com quaisquer espíritos ligados à família Whitehead ou a Josiah. À medida que a investigação continua, os dois exploradores permanecem inquietos depois do que viram do lado de fora, comentando várias vezes o quão real e nítida a figura parecia.
Leads right up to the upstairs stairs. Listen, dude, not to make it dramatic or anything, but, like, I am extremely on edge ever since that happened.
So am I.
Like, I don't want to sound crazy or anything, but I just keep being terrified that I'm going to see, like, something cross a door or, like, jump out at us or something. Yeah. Like I said, I don't mean to be dramatic, but it is, like, heavy on my mind. Like, it's distracting.
It is me too. Like, just because, again, I obviously don't know what it is. I don't think it was, I'm thinking it could have been what we've been calling a feral person or something. It was just very, it was very clear. It was very quick, but it was very clear. And just knowing that, I don't know, yeah, I'm feeling a little on guard and tense as well.
A sensação de estar sendo observados fica cada vez mais forte, e até pequenas coisas, como aranhas e morcegos dentro da cabana, aumentam a tensão e o desconforto. No fim, eles decidem encerrar a investigação e sair da cabana. Já do lado de fora, ainda em silêncio e claramente abalados, eles não conseguem explicar com certeza o que viram ou sentiram lá dentro, apenas sabem que aquele lugar não parecia vazio como deveria estar, e seguem embora sem olhar para trás. Se você chegou até aqui e curtiu o vídeo, não esqueça de se inscrever no canal e deixar seu like. Isso ajuda muito. E aproveita que eu separei mais um vídeo aqui em cima para você assistir agora.